would like to use the maximum time possible for Glenda. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome you, Glenda, to this forum of ISABS, the ABS Summit. Very, very honored that you have accepted this invitation. And yeah, I think I know I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to share on complexity and uncertainty. So true of today's times, I think could not have had a better topic. Just to give us a little bit of introduction about Glenda Eoyang, that's the Glenda Eoyang, sorry. Glenda Eoyang, that's the way she would like it, her name is said. So she has her PhD from the Human Systems Dynamics and was awarded the Circle of Scholars Award for her dissertation, Conditions for Self-Organizing in Human Systems. And after that, she has been the founding executive director at Human Systems Dynamic Institute from 2003, and she continues to hold that till today. She likes to describe herself as somebody who thrives at the edges, between theory and practice, between order and chaos, between past and the future, really on the edge, living on the edge. No? And since 1986, she has drawn lessons from complexity science to help all of us thrive in turbulent and uncertain environments. We need that more than ever now. And today, she does a course where you can become certified in this, and there is a community of over 900 scholar practitioners who follow this process. And what strikes me is that it allows you to build adaptive capacity for individuals, teams, institutions, and communities so that we can all thrive and we can gain insights, options for action, and well-being for people around the world. So over to you, Glenda, for just before we start, for all the rest of us who are listening in, do feel free to type in your questions into the chat box, and Glenda will take the questions in the end. And maybe, so that is the current plan.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for this gracious invitation to be with you today. And congratulations on this auspicious time of celebration for the time that you have spent focusing and using the ideas of organization development to bring change and well-being to all of your organizations and communities. I've had an opportunity today to listen in for the idea splashes and to Dr. McQuan's work, and I've been incredibly moved by the insight and the power of the work that you are doing, and many thanks to you for that. One of our simple rules at the Human Systems Dynamics Institute is that we zoom in and we zoom out. So when we work with communities, we zoom into individual perspectives and hopes and dreams, and we zoom out to see larger patterns of systemic transformation. And so it is lovely to have seen the kind of zooming in to individual work, individual insight and transformation that we've seen so far today. And I'm going to invite you a bit to zoom out, to see not just a larger globe for today and the patterns that you see writ large there, but also zooming out in time. So in 2019, my community went through a process of strategic foresight. We asked ourselves, what would be the impact of our work on the world in 2051? So we looked far ahead, and there were many things that we learned in that process. So throughout the year 2019, we collected data, we scanned, we shared perspectives. We were in dialogue inside our community and outside our community to try to see, as we zoomed out, what the possibility was for the future. And so what we saw was emerging patterns, which are in some ways extensions and expansions of the patterns you're seeing today. And in some ways, they're quite different. And so those patterns, we believe, those emerging patterns of uncertainty and transformation of possibility, but also of great barriers, are going to influence our work as OD practitioners in the future. So what I'd like to do tonight is to share with you some of the patterns that we saw unfolding over the coming decades. And second, to talk about how they have intense impact on our work as OD practitioners. So that is our plan. We are, in fact, zooming out into a larger, broader picture. And at the same time, I invite you to zoom in and to think about your own engagement with yourself and your family, with your neighborhood, with your community, with your organizations that you work with as clients or as colleagues, and with the larger national patterns and global patterns that we are all seeing and responding to in our various ways. So I invite you, as I begin to talk about what we saw in the future, I invite you to think about a particular thing that has surprised you in your OD practice in the last week. And if you haven't had any surprises in the last week, I invite you to open your eyes a bit, because all of us are surprised perpetually. So think of, please, something that has surprised you. It may be about you, it may be about others, and to hold that surprise in mind and to begin making sense of it in the context of the patterns that I'm going to share with you. So I'm now going to share my screen and say that as we begin, we're going to be looking at what patterns are shaping our emerging future. And in human systems dynamics, we think in terms of patterns rather than problems. So a problem is something you can define and solve. A to B, you know the steps, you've done it before, there's expertise. Problems are for solving. Our issues today and the challenges that face us in future are not that kind of problem. They are not simple to solve. They are instead patterns of behavior, patterns of belief, patterns of practice, patterns of policy that we from our positions can help shift so that the patterns become healthier and more productive. But we will never be able to solve these infinite problems. So what are some of the patterns that we see emerging in the future that open possibilities for action? And then, so what does that say to us as OD professionals in our communities and our professional and personal works? And then I'll invite you to think about what's your next wise action. And so, what are some of the patterns that we saw? The first pattern that we saw is what we think of as collective resilience, that over the next 3 decades, individual action and community connection are going to generate hope. And I think you see that in the presentations today, that Dr. McQuan's presentation certainly gave us the possibility of hope in individual perspective. So every child who picked up a stone and saved it for the wall of the museum, each of those children generated hope in a way that our larger institutions are not able to promise or provide that kind of hope. We see that today. We see that collective action and possibility generate hope. And over the next 3 decades, we're going to see more and more hope coming from individuals and small collectives, and that's where resilience will lie more than in institutional power and perspectives. The second pattern, something that we saw driven by technology, driven by economics, driven by possibility, was that patterns of social interaction are going to be radically local, individuals connecting with individuals in places and times, very particular, very unique, and global. So because of social media, because of global industry, because of global supply chains, global possibilities, because of the interventions of the superpowers and the growth of secondary powers and tertiary powers in the globe, there will be global impact and there will be radically local impact. But our research said that the structures in between, national structures, institutional structures, corporate structures, that they would begin to weaken over time. And we're certainly seeing that in real time, that challenges of global warming, of international economic instability, of political and social instability is really making it difficult for many of our corporations or many of our national states to make the kinds of decisions and have the impacts they want. And so we see that expanding over time. So individual and local response and also global connection. It's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to be here with you today, and that your presentations so far that I have seen have zeroed in on that individual local perspective. And that really builds a context in which we as OD professionals can also, in this global community, have a broader, wider impact, zooming out and zooming in. The third pattern has again to do with structures. And one of the things that we saw in our data about what is emerging across the world is that structures, corporate structures, social structures, expectations are really losing the power, and that something else is coming in place, that there are collective work structures, possibilities that are emerging. Sometimes we call them networks, sometimes we call them collectives, sometimes we call them cooperatives or collaboratives, but that level of structuration is where the important human work will be done in the coming future. So think about the ways in which you, as an individual, are connected with a variety of collective structures. They may not have a real strong institutional existence. They may not have a very perpetual, complex governance structure, but that the important work that we're doing today as individuals and as OD practitioners has much to do with a much more informal, relational, emergent connections across the board. We see it in practical, particular ways of the gig culture, where individuals, rather than having a single job over a lifetime, they have small bits and pieces of work that they do. I saw it the last time I was in Delhi with the fabulous work of young activists who had gained wealth from working globally and were investing it locally in very imaginative, exciting ways, some using technology, some simply using the possibility that they saw in unused resources, unoptimized resources in their communities. But those young people were using informal, collective relationships and insights to make massive change across a variety of domains. At the same time, I was there working with the government and with large global institutions. And so I was seeing in that space one kind of change making, somewhat slow and predictable and problem-based, at the same time that I was seeing in the youth a kind of pattern shifting excitement and energy, a source of hope. And so as OD practitioners, we need to learn the skills and the adjustments that we need to make to be able to support informal, emergent, surprising, collective entities, rather than relying on and looking to formal institutional structures. And so I wonder, as you think about your own surprises in the past week, how many of them have to do with these shifts? So I said that we had done this futuring work in 2019, and it was very useful. We finished in October of 2019, and then the pandemic in 2020 hit, and we realized that many of the things that we had anticipated for 2051 appeared in 2020. So the pandemic accelerated many of these changes that we thought would take decades to unfold. And in the pandemic, they were on our doorsteps. And so in many ways, we were more prepared to adjust and adapt to these emerging shifts in 2020 than we would have been otherwise. In fact, in that futuring process, we came to a new vision of the work that we do. And I'd like at this moment to share with you that vision and to ask how you see that vision working out in your day-to-day existence and work as an OD professional. Our vision is that people everywhere thrive because we see patterns clearly, we seek to understand, and we act with courage to transform turbulence and uncertainty into possibility for all. And we see that not just as a vision way out in the future somewhere, but we see it as a vision that we can live every day. We see it unfolding under our feet as we do the work that we do to help people thrive as they see and understand and influence emergent patterns of possibility. We also see that communities and identities, which used to be defined pretty clearly by faith community or geography or national boundaries, that many of our identities were based on those externalized structures. And what we see in the future, in fact, in the emerging present, is that identities are more based on relationships and interests, so that this international community of OD practitioners, scholar practitioners, come together based on interest, regardless of where we are or who we are or what we believe or how our families emerged or how we stand politically, that our interest in health and well-being and equity of human systems is what brings us together across all those other boundaries. And so as OD practitioners, as we think about supporting the human systems that we love and care for and feel responsible to, how do we see and rise the interests that are most useful, most true, and most powerful? And so that we bring communities together across all of those traditional boundaries in order to build the power and possibility that we see driven by the interests that we hold of equity and justice. We also see that over the next decades, the tension that we feel between generations will become irrelevant. So every place I go around the world, in South Africa, in East Africa, in Europe, in Ukraine, in all of the places where I live and work, this tension is emerging between generations. Those of us in my age cohort who are accustomed to having things stable and change, being pushing against those things and getting them to move, overcoming inertia, and younger generations for whom the energy is there and the potential and the movement and change is bubbling up. And so their challenge is instead to direct and focus that energy. But we believe that over the coming decades, that distinction is going to become irrelevant for a couple of reasons. One is that we old folks will retire, will move out of the positions of power that we currently hold and make space for younger, differently viewed folks to step into the roles. And so our voices, though we may remain as elders or mentors, that the real power will move into other hands and that we need to prepare our field and also our clients and ourselves for that transition. The other thing is that as institutions shift and transform, as emergence and uncertainty and chaos move into the worlds that we're familiar with, the institutions and structures that we depend on will begin to weaken, and the powers and the controls that came with them will decrease.
Glenda, I'm going to
Yes.
interrupt for just a second because there are some people for whom the title slide seems to be stuck. So I just want to make sure it's not a general thing and it's only for one person.
Okay.
So can we, I can
What would
see
you
on the
like? You'd like
slides.
for me to stop sharing for a moment?
No, it's okay. I mean, just
we
doing a
can
quick
see.
check. People can see.
can see,
Okay, so
Vasu.
it's not a
See
generic
it's
thing.
moving. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great. Thanks. We can go
Okay.
ahead. Thanks, Glenda.
Thanks for checking. Thanks for checking. And this is probably a good moment to pause and ask, are there things coming up on the chat, that questions that people have or comments that we'd like to share?
Vasu, you are muted, Vasu.
People are appreciating what you're sharing, something about the changing demographics, that it's food for thought. And one comment on consultants coming together for projects is about emerging structures. You spoke about identities. So I think that's that, but no questions as such. I will let you know.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, and it is interesting, as a professional in the field, I began doing internal work inside an organization as an internal consultant that was structured and predictable, and we could have 5-year plans. And then I moved out of that organization and began working with 5-year plans with a variety of clients.
Right.
And then those plans became 3-year plans and then 2-year plans. And now we're working with many clients simply on how do they make a wise choice today. And many of my colleagues are coming together in small groups, and people who used to be clients are now collaborators in projects, and collaborators are, and so our relationships are shifting. And in some ways that's quite exciting. And in some ways it's frankly exhausting. So
Okay.
I suspect some of you are feeling that as well. Good.
There are a
Thank you.
couple of questions here if you wish to take them right now.
Sure.
There's one from Harish saying, what are the signs of intergenerational tensions getting reduced? Because I think many of us, like you said, who are in the older cohort, just see them perhaps more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And there is one more question. How do we actually transform uncertainty into possibility? I guess you will come to that at some point in the future.
Indeed, I will. There are 2 signs that I'm seeing already that the tension between generations is reducing. Now, our research into 2051 said ultimately they'll be gone, but we're also seeing signs today of it. I'll give you one that comes directly from China. So I'm doing leadership training with an OD practitioner in China, Maria Wang, you may know her. She and I are collaborating on a training program there. And our total leadership cohort are young people who are entrepreneurs. So I think maybe one of them is over 40 and everyone else is younger. And they are in charge of the industries that they're creating. And it is very exciting to see them. And they're moving forward very quickly in those positions of power. So they've opted not to work inside the traditional global structures, but as entrepreneurs to start their own businesses, to build their own technologies, and to, in some cases, create new industries. So that's one example. A second example is that I'm seeing many wise elders, like probably some of you, moving into mentoring roles and building our capacity, not just to coach, but to mentor, so that we move into opportunities of learning and growth and change. And so I'm seeing many of my colleagues, some of you probably, deciding to mentor others as opposed to coaching them into the roles where you are. So those are just 2 quick examples. You may have others that you see. And the idea of shifting problems into possibilities, or finding possibilities for all, I will be talking about some tools that we use to do that very shortly.
Let's move on.
Thank you for those questions. I really appreciate those questions. Let's see, I will. Oh, I didn't want to share that. Sorry, just a second. Yes, I see. Oh, bless technology. What would we do without it? So the final pattern that we see emerging, and this has a great deal to do with the pandemic, and I am seeing in individuals and also in the institutions that I work with, that the grief and mourning is palpable. I'm feeling it myself. The communities that I work with are feeling it. The levels of helplessness and loss that we are all feeling is marking us in our social structures and controls. So we're beginning to think about and look at trauma-informed organization development. How can we hold and help others hold the kind of fundamental mourning that comes? We're seeing it now through the pandemic, but we will be seeing it even more in the future through the ravages of climate change, the ravages of social transformation that will come as a result of climate change. All of those issues are bringing deep, deep sense of loss to our communities. And so as OD practitioners, the idea of collective stories, using ritual, using art, will help us absorb that collective grief and fear and transform it into something else of possibility. So these were the patterns that we saw as we raised our heads up and zoomed out to see a future and the role that we might play as OD practitioners, guides, and active participants in this world. And so as you think about the surprise that you've had, and maybe a surprise that your clients have had over the last weeks and months, how many of these patterns that we saw for 2051 are showing up for you today? What are the things that you're seeing in the questions that your clients are bringing to you and the opportunities they're bringing to you? How are you seeing these patterns begin to emerge? And now that we are aware of them, now that you have heard them, seen them, begun to see them in your own practice, that's the first step toward building a capacity for us to respond to them so that we see them, so that we can begin to understand them in meaningful ways, and finally take action to find the possibility in them. And so, what do all of these patterns mean for us as OD practitioners? What I'd like to do is to look at some of the 5 basic functions of us as OD professionals and practitioners. 5 of the things that we see as being our functional roles in the human systems where we work, and how each of these patterns is going to affect those. So let's begin with culture. So all of us as OD practitioners work with culture all the time and in many ways. And we have thought in the past of organizational culture and individual offerings into organizational culture. And for many years, we've thought about there's the culture of this company, or the culture of that company. But in fact, in a complex world, culture is much different from that in this world of masses zooming in and zooming out. So what I'd like to see is if I can share a video with you. So that we can see, as I say, fractal, what I mean by fractal. There it is. Let's see if I can share it. Love this technology again. So I'll notice that this doesn't have sound, but I hope you're able to see it. So a fractal is a mathematical object that's created from complex iteration of solving patterns. These are not mathematical problems to solve. They are patterns that emerge from iterative, over and over and over repeated practice. And we believe that culture is like this in the emerging world, that as you zoom in, you see patterns that are similar to what you see at other levels, but also quite different. So a community culture shows up in teams and groups and individuals and pairs and relationships and families and neighborhoods in similar ways to what shows up nationally. And I think Dr. McWan's story tells this very well, that the kind of cruelty and separation, inequity that he saw in families, in the children that he spoke about, zoom out and show up at all different scales, regardless of what the Constitution says should be. The patterns of culture permeate many, many different scales. And the reason this is important for us as OD professionals is that we have the responsibility to intervene in that pattern wherever we see it. We don't just focus on a pattern of culture in an organization, but that we must look at the pattern of culture that we hold individually, that we amplify in the communities where we live, that we show in our collection as a professional organization. And how do we begin then to see at all those different scales and replicate the patterns that are important, that we care for, that we believe are healthy, well-being, productive, equitable patterns in all those different scales. And that, we believe, is how we as OD practitioners will need to think about culture in the future. Not a culture of a level, but the zooming in and zooming out way that culture shows up in all places, in all times, in all actions, in all narratives. And I acknowledge too that many of you already work in that way, and that it will be your habit that you have evolved over time and practice. But much of the theory base for organization development speaks in a different way. And so I invite you to being aware of your intuition and your fundamental humanity and sensitivity, to bring that forward into the works that you do in and with culture. The second function that we do is about learning. And in most of the organizations where I work, learning and OD, or leadership and OD, are getting closer and closer and closer together. In fact, I had a client found out yesterday in a reorganization, they've now merged under a group, a department that's called Futures, Learning and OD. And this is one of the ways that we can begin to transform turbulence and uncertainty into possibility, to stand in inquiry. Because when things are uncertain, when things are emerging, we don't know what answers are, and we can't be sure about what answers will carry us forward. But what we do have, or can have, are powerful questions to carry with us. And when we say inquiry, and when we say a stance of inquiry, this is what we mean very specifically: turning judgment into curiosity. So as an OD professional, I have lots of judgments about what's better and what's worse and what should happen. And I go into an organization, I see a dysfunction, have a lot of judgment about it and where it comes from. And I have to breathe deeply, recognize that sense of judgment in myself, and to turn it into a question, not a question that is a blaming question or shaming question, but an honest question about how's that working for you? What do you find as a possibility in that space? What can we find together about barriers that can be crossed? Turning disagreement or conflict into shared exploration. And this is about the energy in a system, because often when you're in disagreements, or if there is conflict, and this is at any scale in a human system, in conflict, energy is trapped between the two who are in conflict. And that energy is not freed to do the real and important work of the institution, of the community, of the individuals. On the other hand, if those two can find some common shared exploration, some work to do together, not necessarily a value they hold in common, because maybe they don't, but some work that they can do together and shared exploration will allow them to release and use that energy. So this is another case, another way to turn turbulence and uncertainty into possibility, to turn defensiveness into self-reflection. This is particularly difficult in times of change, where as an expert, I know what to do. It's worked my whole career. It will continue to work. It should work. If it didn't work, it's not my fault. I don't quite go that far, and I'm sure none of you does either. But there is a sense of defensiveness when what I used to do that worked well no longer works, I find myself trying to defend that practice. But if instead I can turn that into self-reflection and say, what am I learning? What am I seeing? What's changing in me? What's changing in the world? So that that reflection becomes an opening possibility rather than a block of being stuck in defense. And finally, the one that is the bread and butter of organization development practice and always has been, turning assumptions into questions. Now, we're pretty good at doing that for our clients, with our clients, challenging their assumptions and helping them move into questions. I find myself not so good at it with myself. We call these practices of inquiry because they are that. You don't get perfect at them, but you do in community and with the reminders of your colleagues, continue the practice of shifting and learning and teaching in the future our role of developing adaptive capacity for our colleagues and clients will be about not learning facts and figures or pictures and models or frameworks and answers, but about learning adaptive capacity, about how to stand in uncertainty with courage and curiosity to move forward. Our job in learning. I'm gonna check time. Next is collaboration. And as OD practitioners, we know that working across silos is important. And yet in these days, and certainly in days to come, we see other and more complex kinds of collaborations. I'm doing a great deal of work now with the Centers for Disease Control in the US, and they're looking at collaboration, not just across their agency, and not just with agencies in regional areas in the US, but global collaborations and thinking about and working in global collaborations in a much better way. Now, again, it is a practice. It isn't a perfected art. But how do we help our clients stand in collaboration? And to do that, we talk about 4 truths. The first truth is objective truth. It's the one that comes with evidence and facts and a truth that everyone would agree to, whatever that looks like. Now, I know many of us in our OD practice, in a constructivist perspective, deny the presence or possibility of objective truth. But what we find in complexity, and particularly in complexity science, is that it's important to identify if there are things that everyone agrees to, that we can have evidence of, that can become a kind of grounding point, that allows a group to move forward and more quickly. So we never know quite what they are, and certainly what those objective truths may change over time. But in a moment, in a place, for a particular perspective, what are the things that we can all agree to? Let's begin there. The second truth is normative truth. What do members in a group agree to? How do we come together as a profession of OD professionals, as an organization of OD professionals? What is it that we hold to be true? And how do we recognize that there are others who hold other normative truths? And how do we engage with them collaboratively to do shared work, even if their beliefs, their truths are different from ours in some fundamental ways? The third truth is subjective truth. And this is the one that is what you fundamentally, deeply believe to be true, regardless of what anyone else says. Each of us has our own narrative, our own truth, our own touchstone for what is real. And we hold those and we believe those and we work with them. And each of us has them. So those are 3 truths. The fourth truth is the one that makes collaboration possible. It says that all of those other truths are true. They're facts, their stories, normative stories and shared, their beliefs, all of those things are true. And in a time and in a place, we focus on the one that's most useful in the here and now. So it may be in a moment with a community where subjective truths are the most important, where there's individual pain of loss or mourning or hope or possibility. And that our job as OD professionals is to open the door for those subjective truths, those personal stories to come into the space. There are other times in collaboratives where normative truths, shared practices and truths become so significant. Dr. McWan talked about this question about, does Dalit exist? Well, there was a normative truth of a power structure, and there was certainly a different normative truth in the village. And so bringing those normative truths together and creating a new normative truth, that work had to be done to make a difference socially, was a fabulous example of, as a practitioner, negotiating normative truth and finding the normative truth that is most useful in the here and now. And sometimes it's objective truth that we need to bring forward and define and redefine. So as our work, as collaborators, traditionally as an OD practitioner, what I learned was that collaboration was about the conversation, the dialogue, getting people to talk to each other, and that collaboration would work if people were talking to each other and listening to each other. But what we realize in human systems dynamics is that collaboration also needs to talk about what are the differences that make a difference. And one of those differences is an approach to truth. So one of our simple rules in our community is find the energy in difference, uncover the energy that's in difference. And so in collaboration, rather than just saying, let's find common ground, let's build a common platform, what we'll have to say in the future, in the kinds of diversity and disillusion that we're going to see, is finding difference and making sense of it, using the energy and difference to move forward. Collaboration. Leadership, which is of course another requirement and perspective that we have, is as OD practitioners, how do we understand leadership? And how do we support leadership in the future? And how do we find a way to redefine what leadership is? And what we have found is that leadership in the future, this shifting, emergent, surprising future, has to do with differences, with paradoxes, with what Barry Johnson calls polarities. And we call them interdependent pairs. Let's just look at one. So as a leader, I have to be committed to efficiency, but I also need to be committed to sustainability. Those are both very good things, and they often come into conflict with each other. Or tradition, and holding tradition and seeing tradition for its value, and also standing in innovation. As a leader, both of those are key. Focusing on the needs of the individual and the group. Now, we as OD practitioners have practiced with that one for a very long time. I'm not so sure that our leaders are conscious of and aware of that tension that they live in. And balancing expertise and inquiry. How can we hold what we know for sure and still stand in the question for the things that we don't know? And so when we think about leadership, we think about it in terms of tensions. Now, these are just a kind of random set that we see very often in leaderships. Different leaders in different industries, in different places, are going to have a different set of tensions. But one of your questions for the leaders that you serve is, what are the tensions that drive their decisions in this complex time? And once they've been defined, then you can say to your leader client, how good are you at the one side? How good are you at efficiency and tradition and focusing on individual and focusing on expertise? How good are you at that? Do you have the skills you need to do that? And then, do you have the skills to work at the other end? Do you have the skills and knowledge and attitudes you need for sustainability, for innovation, for working with groups, working in inquiry? So having both of those sets of skills are key. And it isn't either or, obviously, because both are critical. It's not even both and. because you can't in a moment be both of these. But the question becomes which, when, to what degree? So in a leadership moment, which is the end that's most significant in a leadership moment? And to what degree? Because there are lots of places to be between. And then as a leader, how do you get there? So that capacity is the leadership capacity we see. Building competencies on both ends, the wisdom to see what is fit for function in a moment, and then the agility to be able to shift back and forth with grace and explicit understanding and movement. And so as we work with leaders, and as we think about the leadership capacity, which is going to be so critical in the future, we realize that these are the lessons of leadership that we must carry for ourselves and for our clients. And so, as we think about the OD practice that we are in this moment creating for our clients and establishing a foundation for future, we have a variety of tools that will allow us to transform turbulence and uncertainty into possibility for all. Whether it is looking at culture at multiple levels of scale and influencing and amplifying patterns that are productive while we damp the ones that are not. Whether it's standing in adaptive action, saying, what do we see? So what does it mean? Now what will be next? What, so what, and now what? Leads us into a kind of planning where we are in constant adaptation and adaptive action. What do we see? What patterns do we see of culture? What patterns do we see of truth? What patterns are possible in inquiry? And what are the patterns of tension that are driving leadership roles and perspectives? And so as OD professionals, we will need to dig deeply into our own intuitions, our cultural practices, what we have learned from our worlds and our experiences, and to bring those ideas and perspectives to life on a regular and detailed pace, so that we as individuals will say, what is our next wise action? What is it that we see? So what does it mean? And now what will we move forward? And so with that, I'm going to pause and welcome questions and conversation, questions and comments, additions, alterations.
So I'm saying.
Thank you, Glenda. That was wonderful. It was very insightful and a lot to take in. And though I do think that there is a structure that is quite simple in all the complexity that you have presented. I'm just going to read out some of the comments and then we will take more questions. Chitra says, one emerging pattern that she sees is the ownership of power of individuals to create their own rituals and to deal with things. This was to do with the emerging pattern of dealing with, of creating those rituals and not being restricted to the rituals prescribed by the institutions. So yeah, yes, that is definitely at the tension of what is individual and what is collective, I guess. Harish has several comments. Harish, if you would like to just say what you have written, that will be nice. And I invite Sudeep, if you would like to mention what you've put in the chat box. Actually, you can just unmute. Krish, can we do that? Can people just unmute?
Yes, they can just.
Okay.
Hello, Harish.
I'm not able to, yeah, am I audible now? I think I'm able to unmute, yes.
Loud and clear, Harish.
Yeah, so Glenda, thank you. I love the leadership, shifting focus of leadership which you showed. All those 4 dimensions, they are very true. And however, I have a little discomfort in being able to absorb and accept the culture fractal part which you talked about, because as I see it, and I don't know whether this is true of rest of the world, possibly it is. In India, it is fairly common when you walk into an organization to see Generation X is existing, so also millennials. They are required to work collaboratively. Generation X in this country comes from a collectivist paradigm, whereas millennials are coming from individualistic paradigm. And so if you look at between different teams, there is different culture. So the idea of a fractal being applicable or the patterns being so obvious is not any more obvious. That is the reason you are asking leaders to get into inquiry mode. And so that is my take, and therefore I wanted to hear your views on it.
And it's such a great, great observation. And so it's lovely that you're talking about normative truths, that one team at one level has one shared truth, and another at another, and a third at a third. And I would ask, though, what is held in common across them all? And that then becomes the core of the culture. Is there something that is held among all of them? And I can give you an example. So one of the organizations that I'm working with is a high-tech medical equipment company. It's the best way to think about it. And they have innovative folks who are doing really radical scientific research. And they have people who are doing logistics and factoring, manufacturing and structure. Then they have people who are looking at strategy, long-term healthcare perspectives. And each of those has a very different strategy. And they hate each other, by the way. You won't be surprised. They don't like each other very much. But as we were looking at culture and asking what is it that holds them together, we did many interviews across all of those spaces, asking a really simple question. What's important to you? What do you think is important to your colleagues? And what do you think is important to this organization? And as we pulled all of those pieces together and looked at how they were same and different across the board, what we found was a care for health and for health of the client. And so there was a way that everyone wanted to make people more healthy, and that's why they had come to the company. That's what they were looking for. That's what they wanted to do. And so we focused on that of health and brought it as health internal as well. And so we allowed them to continue to work in their different ways. It was important that they did, that they carried forward. But our cultural conversation became around health, something that they had as a shared normative truth, which doesn't say any of their other truths are wrong. We don't take those away. We simply look for what is a thread, a golden thread that goes all the way through the fractal. Does that match your experience or no?
No, I agree. Like, let's continue with this example of health. So surely health is important, but you may say vegan is the way I want to become healthy. And somebody will say ketos is the way I want to become healthy. And someone else will say something else. Now, what I am trying to say is that, yes, when you look at organizational outcomes, that is real. But when it comes to culture, the national boundaries and organizational boundaries, they don't define culture. That is an easy way for we academics to put a boundary around it and try to study. But in effect, the way culture is working is very different. That's my take, but I don't want to continue in discussion. We can leave it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
There's another really important thing there, I think, that in complexity, we see that diversity is a good thing and that alignment will not happen. So when we look at culture, we don't say, what is everybody doing in the same way, but how are they all moving in whatever way, by whatever path, toward the same end? And so those kinds of differences, how do we adjust and adapt and absorb them? It's a lovely insight. And it's one of the major transformations that we're wrestling with as well. So thank you, Harish.
That was powerful and just shows that the questions you ask can make all the difference. And so it's such an important thing to pay attention to. Sudeep, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Glenda, for that amazing conversation, and it's really transforming. My question is a little bit on a very larger scale, because you did mention during your presentation that interests will start defining communities, which is basically, we are moving away from a traditional approach, and interest is starting to define the communities. Now, my question is, today we stand in a post-truth world. The post-truth world is possibly in itself an example of interest defining communities, although not in a very positive sense. From an OD perspective and from a perspective at a larger community-based level, what are those class divides, if I can say, the segmentation with any of those things which will start coming when interests become common? Because whatever happens, these things actually end up, dividing human beings into different classes. We cannot escape that. What are your thoughts on that and your feedback?
Oh my goodness, is that not our major challenge in the next decade? And I must say that it is something that people around our community are wrestling with and are trying to find a path through. And what I find is that there's not a single solution, but that in every conversation, in every place, in every context, I have to begin to search again and find in that place and time what will build a bond across what looks like an impossible boundary. So I believe that that is an unfolding work and a practice that we must continue to carry around with us as a question. How can we build a bond across this barrier? And that our answers will be different every time we ask the question, but we must keep asking that question. And that bringing that question to the fore in conversations is really our unfolding work.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was very, very powerful. There was another statement you made, which I think is also relevant here, which is how do you stand in this uncertainty and find the courage to move forward? Are there any more questions? There was a request, Dr. Glenda, for, is there any a report that people could read? I think this was especially related to the intergenerational work that you spoke about.
Excuse me, that's a great question. And that particular study is proprietary, so I can't share it, but I will share again. On our website, we have many, many resources and an open intellectual property policy. So please go onto the website, check around to see what's there. And particularly, I'd like to share with you this power of questions that we do every day at 10 o'clock our time, which is probably be 9:30 at night your time or something like that. For 30 minutes, someone brings a wicked issue, an apparently intractable problem, and we ask them questions that they don't answer. They listen to the questions, and then at the end of 20 minutes, they have an opportunity to reflect, and then we close. So every day, Monday through Friday, we have this practice. And if you're interested in joining for us, seeing how that works, please just send us a note to info@. And all of these are blogs and meetings and videos and things that will help share the insights that we have. But that particular research on the intergenerational was proprietary.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to say something.
Sushma, we are almost at the end, so make it quick, please.
Yeah, just 1 second. Hi, Glenda.
Hi, how are you, Sushma?
I'm good. Thanks for the whole thing, as well as I want to emphasize again what you said about inquiry is the answer and the session that you do every day. I think it is one of the best sessions, and I would request everybody to join in. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks that
Thank
you
you,
could
Sushma.
come. Yeah.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
that's really a generous offer, and your website seemed also very generous. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom. I'm sure many people will keep connecting with you after this.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for the
Have a lovely
invitation and
day.
for the
Have a
work you do every day. You too. Nice evening.